Three, two, one, go. There's no go?
No, it doesn't matter. I messed up. It's okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Heavy Pod is Heavy Cast with me, Noyan, and Eden.
Hey, guys.
So, we, again, didn't get a co-host for this week. We'll probably think about that in the near future, but in the meantime, let's just dive right into it. So, what did you do with your week?
My week was very intense musically. I had a ton of new releases, and all of them were great. And it's not just new stuff, it's also stuff I'm coming back to. I really dove deep into Spiritual Migration by Persephone, which I also know that you love. It's an amazing album. I think it might be the pinnacle of the modern progressive death metal movement.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, and I also listened to the new A Dark Orbit album, which is very interesting when we look at the discussion we had last week, because it's coming out on Basic. And Basic has this image of djent, right? And technical progressive, or whatever you want to call it. And this is not that. It features the vocalist that is also on Frontierer. I don't remember his name right now. I think his first name is Chad, but don't...
No idea.
No idea, yeah, but it's like noise meets doom, so it's very slow but very fuzzy, and his vocals are as abrasive as ever, like this super high-pitched screaming stuff. It's really emotional and really great, and it uses like the imagery within djent, so there are pictures of planets on the cover and stuff like that, but it's not djent. So I don't know if they're playing a conscious game with the genre being on Basic, but it's just really good music, which is what
the one
matters
song
most.
I heard from them kind of sounded like sludge wave. That sludge wave isn't really a whole genre in itself, but it's kind of like a micro genre. You're aware of the term, right?
Yeah. I suppose you could categorize it like that, but I think that it's a sludge wave. There's usually the noise here is a bit different. It's not sludgy. It's a bit more static. It's a bit more. It's cleaner in some ways, but that makes it almost alien and abrasive, because sludge wave is much more thick, honey-like, dripping.
Yeah.
And these are not adjectives I would use to describe this. It's more industrial, almost metallic. So that's like the kind of vibe that I get from it.
All right, cool. Anything else you want to mention specifically? Other than...
Yeah, I kind of want to shine a light on Sowen's Tellurian, their sophomore album. And I feel
that features what's his name, Steve DiGiorgio on bass, right?
Yeah, it's sort of a super group. I don't remember the parts, but some of them were in Opeth and others were in other bands. And Sowen is kind of a tragic story, I feel, because their debut album was really heavily influenced by Tool. It almost sounds like a Tool B-side at points. And people did two things. They went into this binary with it. They either dismissed it as just a Tool knockoff or Tool worship, or they took the Tool thing too far and sort of categorized Sowen as a Tool tribute band. So even if they liked it, what they expected from the second album was more of the same. And it's not. It's much more...
I can admit that I'm guilty of that, by the way.
Okay, so you should listen to Tellurian, because there's still the same elements are there. The vocals are very emotional and drawn out, kind of like Maynard's, but there's a lot more progressive stuff in there, and there's a lot of stuff that if you would put the specific effect on them or the right noise, it would sound like death metal, but it's not.
No, I've heard the album, and I agree with you, and I was surprised by it, because as you said, from the first album, I thought it was just going to be like Tool 2.0, but yeah, with the second album, it's not really. It's more leaning on the progressive metal genre more extensively. It's
Definitely.
not just one aspect of it.
Definitely. So yeah, there's a lot of other stuff I listen to, but these are like the shining lights I wanted to turn on.
Yeah, so I listened to a bunch of stuff as well. Some of it we're going to talk about in a bit, but I listened to the new Haunted Shores EP, the like black metalish thing. It's pretty cool. I went back and listened to the whole discography of Born of Osiris. And specifically, I wanted to mention I listened to Bloodshot Dawn's 2014 album Demons. And that album is so great.
Amazing.
So just like I gave that album a 5 out of 5, and I still stand by it. It's just so perfect. It's like encapsulates everything that I always wanted from the genre of melodeath, and then brings it to 2014 standards, and just, it's super super great. You can tell that I listened to this after a discussion we had about melodeath the other day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I love about this album is that it's very much a melodeath album, but it also brings in elements from other death-related metal, so
Yeah,
a bit more technicality, right?
yeah,
So
definitely, and some progressiveness.
yeah, exactly. So it's like this hybrid, but you still recognize it as a melodeath album because they kept the melodic riffs and singing and stuff like
The
that.
riffs are just so good.
Amazing. I mean, I think The Image Faded is one of the best songs, metal songs
Yeah, I
recorded.
mean, it's really hard to pick my favorite song. Like I love Smoke and Mirrors, I love Image Faded, I love Unified, I love Consequence Complex. Was that what it was called?
Yeah, I think
They're
so.
just so good.
Yeah, it's a great album.
And more relevant to what happened this week is among what I listened is first Sixth. Sixth,
Yep.
the famous proto gent band, as I like to call them. They were doing the gent sound, or the sound that influenced gent, more than a decade ago, and now you can hear their influence in so many bands. And I think their last album before they disbanded, Death of a Dead Day, was pretty much perfect. That album is just incredible. So them coming back with a crowdfunder, which is a topic we discussed last week, by the way, is pretty interesting. And they were going to put out an EP, but then they turned it into a mini album, whatever that is. And then they finally released their first song this week. It was called. How do I forget the name of this song?
I don't remember it either. Philistine Philosophies.
Philistine Philosophies. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because it sounds. I think I wrote up the single post for this one. And I said something like, it sounds exactly like what they sounded when they stopped, but with modern production. And I think the production is great, by the way. It is modern, but unlike a lot of other modern bands who do this style, you can hear the small imperfections in their playing, which I think is great, because otherwise you take too much out of the music if you quantize it too much.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because some people are not too hot on this single, from what I understand.
Like me.
And I can kind of see why, because my take on it is that as I said, they're doing exactly what they were doing back in 2006. And the genre has sprouted off from that, and then growed and added more stuff and done different things with, whereas they're doing the exact same thing. And it's a great thing. I think it's their formula and it works very well, but some people are, I think, past that. Do you think that's fair?
I think that is fair, but that's not why I don't like the single. First of all, I personally preferred The Trees and Dead and Dying, Look for Something Wild.
That's also a great album.
That's an amazing album, and I think that, well, I'm like suspending judgment, like we talked about last week about the single, because bands put their weakest leg forward. It's become almost mandatory. So judging an album from a single is a very bad idea nowadays. That's one.
No, I'm not judging the album. Let's judge the single on its
No,
own merits.
yeah. So, but this is my second point. Sixth have always been for me a band that I listen to albums. I never put on one track because I feel, especially with Look for Something Wild, I feel that the whole thing works in a bigger sense, and this is what's missing for me here, because I listen to Sixth for the weird parts, not for the gent parts. I listen to Sixth for the wailing and the Emerson references and the quirky environmentalism and all that stuff, and like how the album works with being weird and then going back to being heavy. So this single, obviously, because it's one track, doesn't have the dynamic of that, and that's why I tend to kind of to agree with you and say I get what they're doing. They're totally saying, look, this is who we always were. There's no point forcing innovation on ourselves. This is what we do best, and we're gonna keep doing this. And I think that's smart, A, musically, and B, in a marketing sense, because I think this is what the market wants from them. They want, I mean, I saw people sharing this and saying things like, the masters have come to reclaim their throne, or here's what we actually wanted in the last 10 years, which other gent bands missed, and stuff like that. So they're going for this retro feel,
And I kind of definitely see that because despite myself being in a band that can partially be classified as gent, I'm not a huge fan of gent, but I love Sixth. And I think that, people have taken the sound from Sixth in different directions, and I don't necessarily agree with all of those directions, whereas Sixth was just perfection for me. Maybe it's because I'm old or whatever, but I think this is more of that. But even then, it's kind of not perfect. I guess I felt that it was kind of too long, or maybe it was too long for how much stuff they have in there. But I did love the weird singing near the end, or the triplet feel change near the middle. There's a lot of good stuff in there. But it's not as dense as some of their better material, I guess.
it's not as dense and it doesn't fit in as well. I mean, you can see the seams, you can see the transitions coming, and you can feel them, and they're a bit awkward. The thing I like about their old stuff is that it flows. You never, when you're walking and you miss a step or something, and you walk out of rhythm and you feel that lurch. So that happens a lot in music if the artist doesn't know how to transition the music properly. And I know that they know that. I saw them live at Download Festival in 2014. It was one of the best shows I've ever seen in my life. That was the big reunion show, right?
Yeah.
They were on point. I mean, the singer forgot some of the lyrics at some parts, but that's fine. They know how to play their instruments live as well. So I know that they know how to write seamless music, but this is not the track that's not what I heard on this track. I heard lurching. I heard, oh, here comes the heavy part. Here comes the intro. Here comes the transition. And it was kind of off-putting for me. But again, yeah. I have high hopes. I think that this track, and people are welcome to check in a few weeks and see if I was right, will be like the upper of the album. It will be like a very dynamic track that they will put in the middle of maybe more contemplative tracks. It's a party track at the end of the day, right? It's almost new metal in parts.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what they were going for, and that's fine, because Sixth have always been a great live band and a band that causes chaos, and they need songs like this to do that. So I respect that.
Yeah. Speaking of gent bands making a comeback, this is not exactly entirely appropriate, but the new Good Tiger album is available now, and it's amazing.
It really is.
I was a huge fan of The Safety Fire. Their debut album, Grind the Ocean, was one of my favorite albums of all time, and I also love Mouth of Swords. And I was very upset when I heard they broke up earlier this year. But then we got Good Tiger, which is the guitar players from The Safety Fire, which is about 60-70% of the point of the band. The vocals are also very important, but the riffs are... Anyway, so them... and Elliot Coleman, who's been in many gent bands in the genesis of the scene, including Tesseract, but this is his first full-length album. And I don't remember the name of the bass player. He's also been in bands. And on drums, Alex Ridinger. And the album is available now. So what are your thoughts on it? Let's hear you first.
I love this album. I think that, it's sort of, because of the image and the people on it, it kind of begs the label of gent. But it does so much more than what that label might signify. Especially, go ahead.
Surprisingly little genty parts, I would say.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing this sort of effect of that term gent, like swelling up and getting so fat that it encompasses things which really don't have anything to do with it. And it comes down to personas. Like, if this guy is on an album, it has to be gent, right? And the marketing is to gent people. And Daniel Tompkins has a Retrowave album coming out soon with who's the guy he's collaborating with?
I forget. I always forget the names of these guys.
Come on, Monkey something.
Mark Holcomb? No.
Hold on. This is embarrassing.
While you look that up, I want to opine on something regarding this album. Alex Ridinger, the drummer, he's a really, really talented drummer, but this is the first album he's been on where I don't mind his drumming. Paul Ortiz Chimp Spanner is the guy you're thinking of.
Chimp Spanner, exactly.
So let me finish this train of thought while I'm here.
Go ahead.
Alex Ridinger is a super tight drummer. He's been in the Faceless. He's been in bands where drumming, really technical drumming has been required. But whenever I listen to some stuff that he's written, I was always disappointed because it feels like it doesn't flow with the music, and it doesn't enhance the music. It tries to take away from it. And here, I don't feel that. Here, it's perfect. It doesn't like draw too much attention to itself, and it actually works well with the music. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that like playing off what I said, this project, if you want to call it that, or band, they have something that a lot of jet bands don't have, and that's cohesion. Things feel like they move together instead of fighting with each other or conflicting with other stuff. Tesseract is a very good example of that. What Tesseract do, and this goes back to what I said about Sixth with the lurching and the seamlessness, there are parts which say, okay, now the bass. And then the bass has this very Tesseract signature sound, and it does a few bars, and then, okay, now the guitar is back, and then the chugs come in. And now it's dance time. It's like everything is a bit separated. And when something is working, the rest of the stuff kind of takes a backstage. And this is something that Good Tiger don't do. They have this level of skill which allows them to play together and do intricate stuff together. This is also something that we saw on the Safety Fire, right? There's a lot of stuff happening. It's never, okay, it's a solo, so the bass needs to go quieter and the vocalist needs to shut up. No, everything is happening together, and it just sweeps you away. You listen to this album and you get taken to another place because everything is very, very powerful, very, very energetic. And the last thing I want to say about this, it's unapologetic. If you look at the video that they released for Snake Oil with the video art, if you look at the way the album is packaged and marketed, and at the end of the day, Elliot Coleman and how he sings, and he took his unique style and he turned it to 11, I think. And everything is just, this is what we do. This is the music that we like, that we want to make now. And that's it, like it or not. It doesn't pander to anyone. And again, I'm going to call out Coleman again on this, because his singing style is very, very, very unique. And go ahead.
I was just going to jump off of that, saying Elliot's singing, because I've seen some people level some complaints against the singing, that they feel kind of off key or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's interestingly, the previous time I heard similar comments was when the Faceless put out their single from Autotheism, The Eidolon Reality, where Michael Keane sings on the chorus. And there's actually a common thread between these, and that is, not to get too music theory nerdy here, but they're both kind of doing chords that are considered more jazzy and singing in ways considered more jazzy, where, in more traditional music, by traditional I mean like poppy and classic, you have the scale, and within the scale you have the whatever, too much detail, but there are ways to sing that are acceptable and conventional. But with jazz, people often tend to try to break from those conventions intentionally, and when this happens with singing, people seem to have a sometimes odd reaction where the singing is not singing within the established patterns. It's still within the framework, but it's just doing different things within the framework, and people sometimes are not too happy with that. But I gotta say, Elliot's singing on this album is great. I was a huge fan of Sean on the Safety Fire, and I was kind of disappointed that he's not going to be here. But, Elliot he's not a replacement, but he does his own thing, and it works very well.
This is something that's never bothered me, but I've heard a lot of complaints about it on another album, Son of Aurelius, and their album from 2013 or 14, I don't remember, Under a Western Sun. Their then vocalist, Riley McShane, who's now touring with Allegaeon, he was produced very differently for that album, and it kind of felt like his vocals were floating above the instruments. And this is something that people are levying against Coleman as well. Like, it's above the instruments, it doesn't settle with them, it doesn't go with them. And honestly, I don't really care. I mean, I look at vocalists as another instrument. Sure, there are lyrics and they carry more messages and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, it's just another instrument. And you don't see people demanding that guitars be on the same level as bass and that everything works together in some sort of magical, harmonious way. It's an instrument, and it's doing things which are non-traditional for it. So instead of going with that knee-jerk reaction of, this is off, this is something new that I'm not really sure how to digest, you should open yourself to viewing the vocalist as another instrument, and then to enjoying the experimentation that he's kind of doing on this traditional whole.
Yeah, pushing that a little bit further in general, I think people can often be very conservative about production in terms of, this is the way it's done, and if you're not within that framework, it's not good. And several albums that I've listened to this year have broken that convention. The Arcturus album, for example, has really odd production, and it was recorded as live as can be, given their instrumental setup.
Yeah.
And I think it works very well for the album, even though the drums sound kind of weird. When you just turn everything up to the point where the drums sound normaler, then everything else just sounds so much fuller and so much interesting. And maybe an example of that not working so well is the new Blind Guardian album, The Red Mirror, or whatever, I don't remember the full name. I really love the music on that album, but the production is really odd and doesn't really work well, but it's still quite experimental, which is weird from a band like Blind Guardian. They're so well established and they don't need to experiment.
Yeah, it's the album is called Beyond the Red Mirror, by the way, and I think the Blind Guardian example is interesting. I want to come back to Arcturus as well, but Blind Guardian, this album is a conceptual continuation of Imaginations from the Other Side. It kind of picks up the story, which is one of the best power metal albums ever made, obviously. But it's interesting that they would use a new approach on an album that's essentially a fallback. So that leads me to believe that it was kind of intentional. I mean, let's get something out there. The mix is terrible. I love that album. I love Beyond the Red Mirror. I think it's the first time that Blind Guardian has sounded like Golden Age Blind Guardian in a long time.
Yeah, definitely.
And I was very excited for that. And it has some of the best Blind Guardian songs ever on that album. Hands down. So good. And then the mix is just so terrible that I'm trying to imagine a veteran musician like Hansi sitting in the studio and says, yep, this sounds good. This is what I want to publish. So I feel like there was some sort of intentionalism here with kind of playing off this fallback idea and maybe throwing a curveball. And that brings me back to Arcturus, because you mentioned the production, but the thing that we should mention here are the vocals. Right?
Oh, yeah.
VCS Vortex, right? That's the guy's name.
ICS Vortex.
ICS, yeah. So this guy is one of the most immediately recognizable vocalists in black metal or metal at all. I mean, you hear his vocals and it's like, okay, this is Vortex. No question about it. And second, the weirdest vocalist. One of the weirdest vocalists. I mean, his approach to vocals, I think that it comes back to what I said about an instrument. Because what he often does is he takes his vowels and he elongates them, and he kind of, sings the O for 15 seconds. And within those 15 seconds, he changes his voice. He uses it as an instrument. It's not just, okay, I'm saying game over now. That's one of the most iconic parts of the album, when he's singing game over and over again. But every time he changes what he's doing, and it sounds almost like a lyre, like the instrument, right? Or something with Indian influences, like these little twirls within the vocals. So I think
he does a lot of stuff that is outside of traditional Western music conventions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that people are, I try to play this album to a lot of people, and they're like, I can't get into these vocals. I just can't stand it. And I think that's a shame, because as someone who listens to so many different genres, one of the things that I enjoy is listening to the full variety that people can use their voices to. I mean, it's amazing that this basically the same instrument, like the throat, which is a complex instrument, but it's not that complex, can create things like Arcturus, Ulver, Anathema. By the way, that's my weekly Anathema quota. Steven Wilson, or whatever.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, with the auto-tuning, where they use, it's literally an instrument. So I love it. I love this diversity, and I think that more people would do well to try and connect to it.
Yeah. Just as a quick side mention, ICS Vortex is actually involved in Celtic style folk singing and whatnot. He's generally very involved in learning different singing styles. There's a really cool video of him singing some folk music. I'll just link it in the show notes.
Yeah, and that's what makes him so interesting and so unique.
Yeah. So, speaking of vocalists, we have an interesting happening this week. So, there's this guy, Alex Terrible, real name Alexander Shkolai. He got famous a few years back on his YouTube channel for posting a vocal covers with his extremely deep voice, including a hilarious cover of Linkin Park's "Numb," where he does super deep growls and then this like ridiculous yelling voice.
It's one of my favorite YouTube videos. Go watch it.
Yeah, I'll link that as well. Anyway, he has a band called Slaughter to Prevail right now, and I think it's with members of Acrania. Anyway, so he had a previous video before where he did a Q&A, and someone asked him about a tattoo on his elbow that is the symbol of the black sun, and saying that that's the Nazi symbol. Are you a Nazi? And he was like, in his old video, no, I'm not really a Nazi. This is just, a Slavic symbol that predates the Nazis, and it was just appropriated by them. That was like a year ago. And then this week there was this article saying, it's a really long article, saying he's a Nazi, and they level a bunch of accusations against him, including the tattoo, another tattoo, people who he hangs out with in the local scene, who are, extreme right-wing and or Nazis. That they show that on his Facebook, he's been invited to this Nazi event, and he wears clothing from this Nazi clothing brand thing. I don't know the really details. You can go read the article if you want. And then on his Facebook wall, someone posted a picture of him wearing a Nazi hat and holding an MP40. So, because of these accusations, a lot of the shows of his band in Europe got canceled, saying that they don't want to support a Nazi. And then he posted on his Facebook that these accusations are not true and he's going to post a rebuttal. And then he posted a rebuttal video on his channel where he got his tattoo covered. And it's gone now. It's just a black circle. He still says that it's a Slavic rune, and the ideology was there before the Nazis. He says that he does listen to some right-wing bands, but he also listens to bands of other opinions, and he doesn't support their ideology. He just listens to them for the music. Similar with his friends, he said that he has friends who believe in different things, and their ideologies are not his business. He said that he's been invited to right-wing events and he didn't go, and even if he did, that doesn't necessarily mean he supports the ideologies at the events. He's been seen in this fight club, apparently, called White Rex, where the article claimed it was a Nazi club, but he says that people of all ethnic backgrounds go there, and he doesn't necessarily support the views of the club. And the clothing brand thing was, he knows through his connections in the scene the guy who owns this brand, and that he had just been gifted T-shirt by them, but he's not going to wear it anymore, and he does not support or want to associate with companies that are fascists. And the photo with the MP40 and Nazi memorabilia, he says that a friend of his father of a friend, I'm losing. A father of one of his friends is a war memorabilia collector, and he took a bunch of pictures with all kinds of equipment, but only this one got posted because it fits the narrative. And he says that his band does not have Nazi lyrics or imagery, and he explicitly condones right-wing views, and says that he will keep working to improve his image. So, what do you think? And do you think he's sincere, or is it just because the tour was canceled and he's doing it for financial reasons?
Okay, so this is going to be a long one. I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. Just for background, stuff that Noyan knows about me that maybe you don't. I study history. I'm doing my MA. One of my most in-depth seminars that I wrote was about the occult roots of the Nazi movement and exploring the symbology and the theory behind what later became the Nazi Party. This is all stuff that has roots in a popular movement in the 19th century called Theosophy, which claims that all philosophies and religions are basically one philosophy and religion. And it also claims a lot of other crazy stuff like Atlantis was real. There are other races. One of them is called Lemurians. They are coaching the coming race, and obviously the coming race are the Aryans. And this is where it all tied into Nazi theory, and from it came the obsession of the Nazi Party with runes, Slavic mythology, Nordic mythology, ancient Indian mythology, and the entire fixation with the alphabet, the runic alphabet, which was, of course, not just a language for speaking, but also a language of power and of magic. This is like a very broad intro. Now, I did some research, because you asked me to, and this is generally interesting to me, about these symbols, and like digging a bit deeper. The black sun is Okay, I'll start. I'll start in a different way. I believe the singer. I believe Alex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything he says checks out. The black sun is indeed not only a Slavic symbol, but also a Celtic symbol. The crosses that you can see on the black sun are called Celtic crosses. And they were used long before Nazi reign, albeit by other movements which he might not want to be sided with. They were also not fascist because it was too early for fascism, but they were pure Europeans, movements, etc., in the 17th and 18th century. But the Black Sun itself you can't say that it's a Nazi symbol. It was used by the Nazis, but so was the regular cross. I don't see anyone writing angry emails to the Queen of England and saying that the cross that she has in her flag is a Nazi symbol. The Nazis appropriated literally hundreds of symbols. The thing that I find more disturbing than the Black Sun is his rune tattoo. That is the Odal rune. The Odal rune used to mean blood and soil, and it was the main symbol of the Hitler Youth movement, and was also used by the SS in many rituals. Now, this rune wasn't really widely used before the Nazis. The runes themselves weren't really widely propagated in Europe before the Nazis did the research. So claiming that the Odal rune, and he kind of doesn't talk about that in his rebuttal. He doesn't talk about that rune, and he doesn't show if he's covered it or not. So that rune is a lot more problematic. Also, I went into some of the links within the accusation article, and most of it is to this very interesting organization which monitors fascism in soccer and football, right? European football, you Americans out there. And it's a very problematic subject. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of the state of hooliganism in Europe and in soccer. It's terrible. These are well-organized gangs which participate in riots and participate in beatings, and a lot of them are skinheads and neo-Nazis and stuff like that. So this Odal rune is used everywhere in this world of extremist, fascist, right-wing soccer groups. So I find it quite indicting that he didn't talk about it in his video, but still, everything else checks out. He got the tattoo covered. That's not something you do if you're not honest. Cover tattoos hurt, and they cost a lot of money because there's a lot of ink that goes into them. Everything he said about I can show up to events who have these people and not support their views, I'm 100% behind him on that. That's true. You can't expect me to keep a roster of political opinions about my friends or about associates, and then whenever someone who is not exactly like how I would like to view the world attends this event, I would boycott it. That's ridiculous. And as long as he wasn't, waving flags and doing the Sieg Heil and stuff like that, then that's fine.
We can't know if he did or didn't.
Yeah, we can't know. About the memorabilia, this is something else which we lack context, and I want to bring that context in. Europe is full of these items. Everybody has items from World War II. It's literally everywhere. And it has this aura of mysticism, these items. I didn't go super in depth into that picture of his, but the only thing that I could recognize that was pure Nazi memorabilia was the dagger. The dagger that he has on him is an SS dagger. But the gun that he's holding and the hat that he's wearing is Wehrmacht. That's the German army. And again, I live in Israel. I'm Jewish, so you know that if anyone is against the Nazis, it's me, right? My family are Holocaust survivors, but the Wehrmacht was an army, and a lot of those soldiers weren't Nazis, and a lot of those soldiers were conscripted mandatorily. So I've always been against piling up the Wehrmacht with the Nazi party because it's just a wrong concept. It's like putting the Italian army with the fascist party. It's not the same thing, right? Armies can be separate from the political bodies. So to bring this full circle, I have like about 4 more hours of ranting about this subject, but I'll knock it down. There's a problem of context here because this band is Russian, which is something we haven't discussed, and in Russia these things are very different than in Europe or in the States. The relationship to Nazi memorabilia and Nazi symbolism is completely different, worse in many ways, but different. That's one. Two, all these social allegations are ridiculous in my eyes. The fact that he was around or proximate to people who have right-wing views is not indicting enough. The only thing that I would like to get a clarification, and Alex, if you're listening to this, please, the Odelrun. I want to see what's up with the Odelrun, because as far as I'm concerned, that's a tattoo that I would never get, nor would I associate with people who did, because it has very specific, very historically solidified meaning as a Nazi symbol, unlike the Black Sun.
Yeah, and he doesn't really address that in the video, as you said.
But he doesn't. He kind of glosses it over, which is problematic.
Yeah. So yeah, we can't really make a solid call here, obviously, but I think it's worth discussing, and I think this can lead into a bigger discussion on whether supporting the opinion of a musician means supporting their views or not. So would you like to get into that?
Yeah, we posted a bit about that on the blog, right? Separating the music from the artist. And again, we encourage dissent, but I don't agree with the views that were made in that editorial, because it was mostly, yes, you should separate the artist from their views. And honestly, I think it's a more complex issue. I think that it's, something that historians are taught to do from a very young age. Yes, but. So, yes, but depends which views. If you're talking about someone just being an asshole, or someone having political views which you don't agree with, definitely separate the music from the artist. I'm not going to stop listening to some artists because I find out that they're libertarians or Republicans or whatever, because those are legitimate views. I don't agree with them, but it's legitimate to hold those views. We live in a democracy, me less so than you, because Israel is a bit problematic, but it's still a place where we can have these discussions, so that's fine. I draw the line where these views, and every person needs to draw their own line. I draw the line at certain levels of views. If someone is a criminal, if someone is racist, if someone is transphobic, homophobic, sexist.
Sounds like you're just describing Varg Vikernes to me.
Well, I despise Varg. I despise that person, and I think that every single person who still looks up to him should take a strong look at his life, because that man was arrested for having assault rifles in the same house where he had an anti-Semite manifesto. So this is not, and he's a convicted murderer, right?
Yeah, he's a convicted murderer for murdering Euronymous.
Yeah.
Back in the genesis of black metal, as we talked on the first episode, and I think he does not show remorse for his actions. He tried to escape prison near his release. I think I'm not 100% on the details, but now he lives in France with his wife and kids. He lives in this in the middle of nowhere, and he's trying to live this weird, self-sustaining life or whatever, and he's creating an RPG system, which is just...
So, I mean, again, I could go on for hours about how all those elements interact, but at the end of the day, what I'm saying is you need to have red lines. And I'm not here to tell you what those red lines should be. A person can come up to me and say, you know what, using cocaine is not a red line for me. But there are bands out there who I know are active cocaine users, and I don't listen to them. And I don't buy their music because I don't support widespread cocaine use. And I'm not saying, again, if someone comes up to me and says, I don't care, I listen to these bands even though they use cocaine, I'm not going to tell him, you're a bad person, you shouldn't do that, because that's not something that I do. I'm just saying everybody should have red lines, because you do support these artists. You get their music out there, you get their names out there, even if you pirate it. You contribute to the success of these artists, and you should have red lines on what kind of people you want to support.
And yeah, some people don't seem to really get this, but when you support an artist, you support that by paying them. You support them going out there and potentially delivering their message to other people. So you need to think twice about doing these things. Not, as I said, choose as you said, you can choose to support or not support an artist, but you need to understand the consequences of what doing this entails.
Definitely, and I think that you need to understand the consequences, and you need to not belittle your role, because people, this is a very well-researched psychological effect. When there's a large group of people tend to disperse the responsibility, right? And say things like, someone else will get it. So they do this here as well. I'm just a drop in the ocean. I'm just a little guy. And the argument that infuriates me the most is, if I stop buying their albums, nothing will happen. But if we as a community decided that there are red lines that cannot be crossed. Let's give you an example that a hardcore band can't fucking beat the vocalist of another band because he talked trash about them and put him in the hospital, which is a true story that happened.
Yep.
And they should be dropped from every single label ever. We can, as a community, decide that that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. You can't do that. And if we decide that as a community, and again, I'm not saying that I should be the one to decide what the community thinks is a red line, but I think that the community should have these discussions and decide dynamically on these red lines so that we can stop these people from profiting and spreading their message, as you said, via the channels of this community.
Yeah. And to segue off of saying supporting bands, so there was this article recently that said maybe Spotify isn't as bad as we think it is. And the article basically argued that originally old media was kind of arguing that Spotify is taking away from sales. But there is evidence that Spotify might actually be stimulating sales. And, because it's like maybe you download the album, but you go to see the band's show now and you support them in another way. Or it's easier to check out music. So it's, you send it to your friends and maybe your friend becomes a super fan. And of course, there are problems with Spotify's payment model, but there's this interesting outlook to this that hasn't been used before. And I think one of the piracy arguments that has been always used is that, piracy is not necessarily a lost sale. A person who pirates something isn't necessarily a person who was just going to buy it but decides not to and pirates it. Oftentimes, a person who pirates something had no intention of buying it at all, either because they just wanted to check it out and they pirated it, or they're just too poor to buy it and they're just downloading it anyway. And this argument has been used for Spotify, stating that, people who stream an album on Spotify aren't necessarily a lost sale. They weren't going to buy the album anyway in some cases. So how do you feel about this?
I think that we need to say a few things about the article before we jump into the content. First of all,
sure,
this is going up on 538. And for you non-Americans, this is a site started by Nate Silver around the elections. 538 is the number of electorates in the college that elects the president, right? Nine? Right on this one? Yeah. And the idea is using statistics to analyze common trends, not just elections now, but also NBA, football, economy, stuff like that. So this isn't some site. This is one of the biggest sites dealing with statistics today. And these are serious guys.
I honestly did not know this, so it makes it's more legitimate to me now.
I follow 538. I signed up to their newsletter. They put out some of the best content, I feel, today on the internet. And these aren't just some guys. These are guys with degrees in this, right? The guy who wrote this is the quantitative editor for the blog. So it's not just some guy. This guy has, credentials. And what the blog post actually says is that the research that was made on Spotify is inconclusive. But the fact that it's inconclusive is also saying something, because maybe people expected the research to be conclusive and say, obviously Spotify hurts sales, that just makes sense. Rather than buying the album, I would just stream it. So the fact that the article is inconclusive and it says, we couldn't really find a very strong link between streaming and album sales, is the conclusion, is the interesting conclusion here. So, and
I want to just stop you here as a statistician here, because I basically do statistics as my job, and saying that you can't find a conclusive link between A and B is actually a strong statement. It's not we're throwing our hands up. It's that is a statement that you tried and you built models on top of it, and you could not find a link between those things. You could not conclude that there is a link between those things or not, and that is not a non-statement. I just want to point that out.
Definitely. I think there are also all sorts of criticism being levied against the research. There are methodological problems and etc. And it's not peer-reviewed yet. It's published, but it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, and that's a big deal. So we should take this with a handful of salt and maybe be very careful when we use this to say grander things. But I think that the most interesting thing about this article is if you scroll down, there is a quote by I think it's the CEO of Spotify. I can't find the quote right now. And what he's saying is that here we go, I found it. This is Will Page, Director of Economics at Spotify. And what he says is this: the business of music ownership has been in decline long before Spotify came along. Is it fair to assume people were going to continue buying in the first place? So what he's pointing at is that there's been a structural shift long before Spotify came in.
Definitely.
And we can say now that music ownership is in flux. What is music ownership? Who owns an album? What am I allowed to do with an album once I own it? We talked about Ben Sharp and Creative Commons. There are a lot of other questions out there. So I think that, and this is the last thing I say before I pass the mic back, I love Spotify. And sure, there are problems with the revenue. I just learned today that Bandcamp, for example, take like 21% from each
That's
sale.
actually a new thing. I just noticed that on Bandcamp recently as well, and I just saw Sarah Longfield of her solo project and the Defined Constant post on Facebook. Bandcamp recently changed their terms, so they take a lot more money now.
Yeah, so there isn't really a service right now which is altruistic. And I'll tell you the truth, it's innocent to expect such a service to exist. This is a money-making industry. So we need to find the business model that we as consumers like, and then give that model our money, because that will decide the future of music ownership, where the money is, and the service that makes more money, be it iTunes, Spotify, Bandcamp, Pandora, SoundCloud, whatever, that is the service that will get to survive. So we as consumers need to ask not whether a perfect service exists, but which of the services is closer to that perfection.
Yeah, it's also amusing that the new Sixth video actually had a Tidal logo in the beginning of it for whatever reason, but I don't know who cares about Tidal. I've never used Spotify because when it started, it wasn't available to me, and by the time it got big, I just never jumped on the bandwagon. But now I'm on the Apple Music bandwagon, which is fairly similar. It's you take a little bit, you give a little bit, but it's basically the same model. And I definitely agree with the statement that you quoted, stating that music ownership has been in decline long before Spotify came along. We had, people might not remember this nowadays, but we had the whole like Napster Kazaa thing, and Metallica suing them, which was just a hilarious shit show. And even before then, back in the day of cassettes, people would still copy their cassettes to each other. There was no DRM back then. You could just copy your cassette. Like there was always some sort of method of skirting ownership. It's just that now it's become a lot more commonplace, a lot more easier with the internet. So the industry is forced to adapt to that and come up with new models that are still profitable for the industry, the musicians, and the fans. I mean, profitable for the fans in the sense that fans think it's a fair service. And in these discussions, I always go back to Steam, which is gaming, but not. It's relevant. And the CEO of Valve, Gabe Newell, the company that owns Steam, says that piracy, I don't remember the exact quote, but piracy is basically a problem you solve by not trying to combat piracy because you can't defeat them, but instead you compete with it. So what they do is for people who don't know, Russia is just riddled with piracy. It's considered one of the hubs of piracy. Yeah. But what Steam did, they made a system for Russia where their prices are a lot cheaper than the rest of the world, so that it's more affordable for Russian people. And I living in Turkey, this also is relevant to me because in Turkey, a game that you could buy for $60 in the US would be like the equivalent of $200 in Turkey because of taxes, luxury taxes, customs fees, and the exchange rate for the dollar.
Yeah.
Anyway, so by making their service way more affordable and way easier to access than piracy, because in piracy you have to find a crack and you have to dodge viruses, which is not a huge issue, but for games it's a bigger issue. And by making it a convenience issue, they basically have turned a market that is known for its piracy into a kind of some people actually buy games here market. And I think the model that Spotify and other streaming services are trying to do is kind of similar to that, in that you can listen to some music for free and that's good enough for some people, and if not, then you just pay your monthly fee or whatever, and then you can listen to as much music as you want within certain confines. And maybe this is, as you said, this isn't the perfect model, but I think we're going to constantly evolve and get there, and I think these models are doing so well right now, not because they're the most profitable model for everyone, but I think because they're the most convenient model for people. Because there have been other DRM methods before and other distribution methods before, but they were terrible and very anti-consumer, and people just did not want to use them, so they died away. But now Spotify is fostering, and as long as they keep making money, they can keep delivering this thing to people. But the question is, how do you balance the money you make, the customers you make happy, and the artists you feed, right?
Yeah, I think that, something which is feeding Spotify and these services is the chokehold that labels and moneymakers are trying to keep on music. As long as they're trying to chokehold it, more and more people will use these services. I think that when the current services need to start being concerned is when that chokehold releases. Because once that happens, I feel that there's a lot of potential to cut out these middlemen. And they are middlemen, right? Why do I need Spotify? Why do I need Bandcamp? If Roadrunner Records, which are notorious for their lack of collaboration with these services, when Roadrunner Records says, okay, we've obviously lost this battle, why don't we just retreat and put our music digitally for streaming every single release, and then you can buy it if you want. Once that happens, they won't need Spotify. They will just do it on their own website because they're Roadrunner Records and they don't need any third party to host their music. So
Sumerian Records wasn't on Spotify for the longest time, but as of I think last year, they're on there now.
And, but Sumerian isn't Roadrunner. I'm talking about big game changers out there.
Is Roadrunner not on Spotify? I thought they are.
No, they are, but it's problematic. Bandcamp, you can't find any of the releases there.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
You can't find it anywhere, and Spotify takes a long time until the album actually goes up. And they have this sort of policy of, putting sticks in the wheels and making things go slower. I guess they're doing their numbers. I don't think they're idiots. I guess they're seeing the profits somehow, but the scales will tip eventually. I don't want to be all, Marxist and talk about historical determinism, and the rise of the mighty music streaming proletariat. But I do think that the trend that we're currently seeing is heading towards that direction, and the chokehold needs to fade away before we can actually achieve a level of service which will please fans and musicians alike.
A big instance of this was when Beyonce put out her new album without any notice, straight up on iTunes before retail. And retail stores were extremely upset with her for doing this, but it was an interesting experiment. And Beyonce, of all people, she's one of the biggest artists out there.
Do you know who also did that?
Who?
Way before Beyonce.
I don't remember.
Disfiguring the Goddess.
Huh.
It was supposed to be one album, and then they just dropped two without any media announcement, without any notification. They just dropped two albums. So and it created a really big hype because everyone was like, what's happening? We expected one album and now we have two, and we don't know anything about the second album. What's going on? It worked really well.
Unlike some other band that sent one album to reviewers and then released another one. But
we won't mention that band.
But yeah, I think this is a very open-ended question, and we keep coming back to a lot of these topics because, these questions are open-ended, and we keep, everything keeps becoming relevant to these central questions of what's the best way to distribute music, how to get it to fans, and how to monetize this, because, as we said earlier, artists need to make money, and labels need to make money. Then maybe labels don't need to make money, and the market will decide that, but we're not at that point yet.
True.
So speaking of aspects of music that aren't necessarily just the music, imagery and mood in general is a very strong aspect of music that doesn't have a lot to do with the music inherently, like album artwork or the attire of a band. So I think this is something more that you want to talk about first, so I'll let you handle the mic.
Yeah, I think that, for me, music is such an emotionally charged experience and something which I listen to, whether to create a certain mood or to feed into a certain mood, and often also to dispel a certain mood. I'm feeling down, I listen to something upbeat, or even the other way around. But when I looked at it and I try to introduce people to music, I played them a certain track, and I'd say, "This is a happy track," and they would listen to the track and say, "There's nothing happy about it. It's just music." I mean, I'm hearing the chords, I'm hearing the major progressions, I'm hearing the vocalist being upbeat, but what's happy about it? And I started digging into it, and I realized that a lot of it was how I approached the album before the music, and what the album tried to tell me. And there are many examples of it. I think that I'll give you an example of one album. A post-rock band called Vasa released an album called Colors. And the cover of the album is VA, right, Vasa, with all these colors exploding out of a white background. And this is the post-rock that they do, a very upbeat post-rock. But before I even pressed play, I sort of knew what to expect. And I knew what mood to get myself into. I need to be excited, I need to be pumped up, energetic, all that stuff. And then when I pressed play, lo and behold, I felt energetic and I felt pumped up and stuff like that. We can give a second example, which is much, much more maybe clearer. Black metal. Black metal comes, and again, we go back to this genre, comes with a lot around it, right?
Yeah.
Some of these albums come with manifestos about nature, mankind, the soul, spirit, stuff like that. And I don't
Paganism, the old religions.
think exactly. So I don't think the point is the manifesto itself. No one is trying to spread their philosophical ideas through black metal, because that's not a very good way to do it. But what they're trying to do is get you into the mood that the music was written under. This awe of nature, this awe of spirit and history and stuff like that. And it works.
And of the white master race.
Yeah, I suppose.
Because that is a thing in a lot of black metal.
I suppose, but I'm talking about, more modern stuff. It has a lot of mysticism and essentialism and this nature worship. And once you listen to black metal under the auspices of those passages, it becomes something different. It becomes something grander. It can be rebuking existence, rebuking power, finding connection with bigger things. And I don't know if I'm just susceptible, but I suspect that I'm not, and it works for other people as well. It really changes how the music hits me. It really changes how the music affects me.
For me, it's sometimes a bit hit and miss. Maybe it's because I'm kind of an emotionless robot. But so I've done a lot of, just see the cool album artwork and buy something and go in with certain expectations. And sometimes been disappointed because the music doesn't match the artwork. Like, the artwork is really crazy and colorful and out there, but then the music is just, whatever.
Yeah.
But the imagery does play into my feelings about the music as well. Even if we go back to Good Tiger, I think the imagery for Safety Fire and Good Tiger partially comes from Dez, the guitar player, and he is kind of the mastermind behind those projects. They've always had this very minimalistic, but very colorful, but not pastel colors, kind of faded colors type of imagery, and line drawings, and very thin fonts. And it's kind of very uniquely British in a way. And I think that does kind of play into my, not necessarily of how I feel about the music, but how I feel about listening to this music, if that makes sense, which is kind of different from how the music creates feelings inside me, because that to me mostly comes purely from the music. But when I'm listening to this, this album that has a yellow background and a line drawing of a tiger on top of it, I just feel like it's something different than when I listen to something that has just blood and guts and gore everywhere. It's not a feeling that I can very clearly describe, but it just puts me in a different state of mind. And that's slightly separate, as I said, from what the music's tonality is. Because, so, to go a little bit more clear on this, because I think it's not really clear for a lot of listeners, I think there's the emotion that the music is giving you. And like you said, there's the emotion that you have. And the feeling you get when you listen to music is, maybe I'm going like 3 deep 5 years right now, but the combination of what you hear and the combination of how you feel at that time. So I've often had an album I listened to for the first time under the wrong circumstances, and it just didn't click with me, and I was like, whatever. But then later on I returned to it, and I think it's amazing. And I think this kind of plays into it here, and you can often prepare your listener, if you will, by making a statement with your artwork. And some bands don't care; they just go for something that they think looks cool. But some bands are very deliberate, and I think Safety Fire and Good Tiger are a pretty deliberate band. I don't think Sixth are that deliberate. For example, their videos have a common imagery in terms of how it's filmed, and their artworks are cool, but they don't really convey something to me. For example,
I think that to add to what you said, it also you talked about the attire. So I'm gonna take the attire and talk about the image of the artist. And
before that, I just got a really good example. Sorry, Enslaved. Again, one of my favorite bands. They've been doing a very specific progressive black metal sound for several albums now. Their sound was kind of a shift, and then since that shift, they've been very consistent in this sound. And ever since that shift, they've been going to the same guy to get their album artwork done. And he uses charcoals and oil paintings, and he creates these really minimalistic and folky, weird drawings full of runes and really interesting imagery. And I think that really plays into it again. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to take the reference to attire and lift it up to the image of an artist and how that image excuses things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to suffer. So, for example, a lot of times when Sun, right? Sun, the drone band.
Oh, Sun, parentheses, close, parentheses, close, parentheses, close.
Exactly, that's how you pronounce their name. So I let people listen to them and they're like, oh, they're bad at music, right? They don't know how to make music. It's just noise. And like when dad takes his kid to a modern art museum and he says, oh, my 3-year-old can draw that. So kind of the same thing. And then I say, wait, look at how these people play live. Look at their occult attire. Look at the smoke. Look at the monitors. They're saying something. There's a message behind here. And some people say, oh, okay, now I get it. Because they see that it's intentional, that someone has constructed an image and through that image a meaning to this music. And you can see it not even in metal. Like, for example, let's drop a potential controversial truth bomb. Punk was never a very challenging or interesting style of music. But what people said is, look, man, these people actually live in squats. These people actually live up their ideals. They have this image, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, all these guys, the Ramones. They're like, they live the image that their music is trying to create. So it doesn't matter if they use one chord. They use one chord because they're pissed. And they're pissed
except for when they become successful multimillionaire bands.
So that was the second stage, that when the image changes, I mean, they can release the same album that sounds almost exactly the same, but now they have money and they drive around in limousines, and it's not just that they sold out. The album is not as good because people aren't able to excuse what they used to when the image of the artist influenced that music. So often when people say, you know what, another great example that you will love, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I show someone an image of that band, they'll say, oh, they're doing screamo, right? Blood on the dance floor level type of stuff. And they probably sing about cutting themselves and stuff like that, but they do that. And I told you that I think they do that on purpose, right? The dissonance between the music and the image is something that creates interest and creates discussion and stuff like that. So that's just another example.
So that image thing with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, there's this scene in Japan called Visual Kei, which is overly gothic and ridiculous, colorful. And I think they drive more from that type of scene. And in the West, it's kind of interpreted as more screamo, but there's actually a huge culture for that in Japan. So maybe not the best example there, but I know what you're saying. And I actually wanted to go back to the thing about angry artists, because a lot of people always level this criticism against the Dillinger Escape Plan, where their live show is, extremely intense and they're very angry, Greg Puciato cuts himself, jumps over like a stack of amps and whatever, and they're really sloppy because they're just going mad or whatever. But a lot of people say that, hey, okay, that made sense when you were young and angry, but now you guys are one of the biggest bands in metal. You made it. Your name is in the Hall of Fame, not an actual Hall of Fame, but And people say that it's not genuine anymore. So is that a the valid complaint.
I mean, I think that Greg is a very interesting example because he now does a side project called the Black Queen, and it's this retrowave electronica project. And there was a very interesting interview with him on Rolling Stone. They do something proper every year, maybe. So that interview was very interesting because Greg said, the person that you saw on the stage in Dillinger Escape shows had issues. I have problems with anger and violence. And he had a psychotic breakdown, right? He wandered the streets, he was lost, he forgot who he was involved in fights, and he had a lot of problems. And now he's doing the Black Queen, and he says, this is a way for me to channel the other side of me, the calmer side, the cooler side, which is not necessarily the better side. It's depressive, it's stuff like that. And look how he changed his image. In the press for this project, he has that thick hipster trench coat, you know what I'm talking about, with a high collar, and he wears that, and he leans against the wall, and it's like a frozen river, which is a play on one of the first tracks that they released. But gone is the Greg of, jumping over fans and cutting himself, and he has a tattoo from almost everywhere he played that says "kill posers" in the local language. He did one when he was here in Israel, he did one in Hebrew. So his image is, and this is something that is very important for me, and again, I don't have the time to go into it in depth, but the relationship between symbol and its meaning is two-way. That is, you can conjure up a meaning with a symbol, and not just the other way around. So it's not just there's a meaning, and it creates a symbol, and you use that symbol. Often when you create the symbols, you invoke the meaning that you're looking for. So if I want to be angry, it's not that I'm angry and then I have tattoos that say "kill posers." It's that often I collect these tattoos and then it becomes perceived as I'm an angry person, and I become an angry person because of it. It transforms me. So the relationship between the image of the band and the music that they're making and the meaning behind that band is impossible to detach. One last example, Devin Townsend.
Of course, I knew it was going to come to
Devin. It was going to come to Devin, right? Because the image that he had in Strapping Young Lad, the skullet, right?
Yeah.
The clothes that he wore, which were almost crust, right? They were dirty and threadbare. And then Devin Townsend project, these super sleek suits, right? Bald, clean bald, and he's a master at manipulating his image and creating this sort of persona, which is Devin Townsend the artist, which might have nothing to do with Devin Townsend the person, though in his case I suspect that it has a lot to do, but there's never a complete break. So
of course,
the interplay here is very complex, and I think that it's like a silent partner in how we listen to music, and that not a lot of people give it the time of day to consider, maybe I don't like this band because I'm not listening to it in the right mood, or because their image rubs me the wrong way, which is fine, but you need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I agree. And some bands try to do it. For example, Trivium, they kind of adopt a different look every album, and they kind of have a different emotional set of directions with each album. But it's not really strong of a connection. If you look at Leprous, they had a different look on Tall Poppy, on Bilateral, and on Cole. And when I talked to Einar in an interview, he said that, they do it because they feel like the album is coming from a different place, and they want to emphasize that, and also want to be consistent with how they sound. And that actually makes sense because they didn't change their image for the new album, by the way, if we go back to my complaints about the congregation.
So it's like a new chapter within the Cole story, right?
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, so another interesting thing, for example, if you look at Dark Tranquillity, Mikael Stane, their singer, he always wears a black shirt, like a work shirt, and tight black pants. And they always have this kind of mystical image. If you watch their live shows and whatnot, It's very singular. And the image came after the sound in that case, because they've been going towards this type of sound for a long time. But over the years, they kind of refined their image. And again, in an interview with him, I had asked that, do you only have this one shirt? And he's like, no, it's just that he wants to convey a certain persona on the stage. And I think, yeah, it definitely works for bands, especially bands that commit to it. But one thing that you said about Greg actually kind of intrigued me with his solo project being different from Dillinger Escape Plan. For some reason, it reminded me of Tommy Giles and Between the Buried and Me.
Yeah, definitely.
Because Between the Buried and Me's sound has been changing over the years slowly, but their recent album was more of a departure than their stuff had been for a while. And that was kind of surprising to me. And if you look at his solo stuff, I don't remember. It was called Giles, right? And he had 2 albums, I think.
Yeah.
The new album of Between the Buried and Me is actually kind of reminiscent of his solo stuff to me.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to briefly touch on how the artist can have his own thing. And we've seen many artists do this. They have their own band, and then they want to do a different sound. They either branch off and do their own thing on a separate project, or they take their main band and change that to where they want to go. Or sometimes, in the case of Tommy Giles, they come back and bring that into the main band. And an example here is, again, we talked about this, Opeth, where I think Mikael there could have done this music with another project, but he chose to change Opeth into this. So how do you feel about the choices that the musicians make here and what it tells about how they view their music? Because I think there is a different attitude that musicians can have towards what their music means to them, as as an extension of this whole image discussion.
I think that first of all we have to address the issue of how big of a name does the original band have, and how much of a myth is created around this band. Because even though Dillinger and Between the Buried and Me are big, they're nowhere near Opeth big. Nowhere near, as far as number of listeners outside of metal, the influence, nowhere near. So I think that when an artist like Mikael is looking at the Opeth name, and this is where image comes into it again, it's a lot harder to break off and just start a whole new project, especially when it's a band that he propelled and he moved forward and he controlled for so long. The psychological aspect needs to come into play here, and it's much harder to say, oh, okay, I'm Mikael Åkerfeldt, and I'll release a project called Mikael Åkerfeldt, or Åkerfeldt or whatever, and it will be just retro prog, whatever. And then,
but he kind of did that stuff with Steven Wilson.
But that was Steven Wilson's project. It was Steven Wilson's Storm Corrosion, right? It's not Steven Wilson and Mikael Åkerfeldt Storm Corrosion. It was very obvious. And by the way, Mikael is only on 2 tracks from that album, I think, and a lot of it is like atmospheric stuff. Yeah, so it's Steven's project, and Mikael is sort of a guest vocalist, right? So So I think that that's the first thing, right? The weight that the band has makes it harder to just quit and just go do something else, and it also makes it harder for stuff to seep back. So I think that when the band has a lot of weight, air quotes, it becomes an issue of breaking, like he did with Heritage, and just saying, this is still the name, I am still that man, this is still that image. And Heritage does have common images with the rest of the Opeth discography, right? Frozen Wastelands and the Devil and Corruption and stuff like that, and the Undead. So and the second point I want to make, and this is very important to me, is that I don't feel that the fans have any claim or any justification in criticizing the musician's decision here. This is, at the end of the day, a group of people, maybe not that relevant to Opeth, but definitely to Dillinger and definitely to Between the Buried and Me, and they have to make decisions which are best for them. And fans which say, like, you can't use the Opeth name to release different music, or you shouldn't have done that, you don't get to make that decision. You don't own Opeth. Sure, you pay them and you're the reason they exist, but you don't own the trademark. I mean, if everything that I gave money to, I suddenly owned it, I would own, the state of Israel because I pay taxes. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. I support Opeth not because it gives me a part of Opeth, but because I like the music and I want to reward the artist for making it. But if Mikael decides tomorrow that Opeth is now making J-pop, I wouldn't buy the album, but I wouldn't say you can't call it Opeth.
Another example that comes to my mind from the same country is actually Daniel Gildenlow and Pain of Salvation.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really big one because it's kind of the same trajectory, right? And they're also
Yeah.
from Sweden.
Yep.
And like this one man who took charge of the band and sort of continued it and changed the style completely. I mean, between B and Road Salt 1, there's very little in common. Less in common, I feel, than Heritage and Watershed, for example.
Yeah.
It's a much clearer and more abrupt break. But Pen of Salvation, and no one said anything. I haven't heard anyone saying, why does Daniel call it Pen of Salvation? Because I think that very early on, it kind of became clear that it was Daniel Gildenlow's band,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was his thing, as well. Opeth never kind of shook. It was never, this is Mikael Ackerfeld's band. No, this is Opeth. This is something that we all partake in. So, very different bands, very different idea of what the image of the band means.
Definitely, and yeah, that's actually an interesting distinction, and I think that probably makes sense here. Another band that comes to my mind, and you might not be familiar with these guys, there is a Finnish band called Amoral.
Okay. I know the
They
name.
had one or two albums of progressive-ish death metal, and then their singer, who he was mainly a screamer, left. They got a new guy, and they started making radio glam. And they made like 4 albums or maybe more, and they don't play any of the older material, or like they play one song every once in a while. It is ridiculous. And I mean, here you can't help but think whether they, and this is a completely different can of worms, but you can't help but think if there were commercial concerns here, and whether this was legitimately the music they wanted to make. And maybe it is legitimately what they wanted to make, but it's a really weird transition, and nobody knows about this band. But I think it's a very, very interesting example.
I want to actually feed off glam here and talk a bit about context and about how the image is influenced by context. Because when we look at the 80s today, at least when I look at the 80s, I'm like, guys, what was going on? Was everybody on LSD in the water or something? I mean, what sort of person looks at these outfits and says, yeah, this is what I want to wear? But the reason that that's the case is because I don't live in the 80s. And I'm not suffused in this context of what these people were trying to say. And it's about gender roles, and it's about economics, and it's about politics, and a ton of other stuff. And it makes you wonder, what will look weird in 20 years? I mean, I already find new metal weird. I mean, I look at Limp Bizkit's videos and I'm like, what were you thinking? You can't do that. You can't dress that way. But I remember when I was a teen, I didn't mind. It was cool. They were kind of awesome. I mean, I was into them. I still think they're a good band. But I was also into their style and stuff like that. And it's the same thing, when I was 16, I wore only black, and I hung Metallica lyrics on my walls, and my mom got concerned that I was going to kill myself. But yeah, when I look back at that, I'm like, what the hell were you thinking? Why would you wear only black and try to look like a corpse or try to look suicidal? The context of A, the historical period that you operate in, and B, the time in your life that the music comes along, plays not just a role in creating that image, but it plays a role in deciphering the image and making that image make sense. And once you move out of that context, that image doesn't make sense anymore. And it's a question of whether you hang on to that image, or you let it go, or you transform it into something new. And all these approaches are legitimate.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, all of these approaches are legitimate. And there are bands who do any of them well and do any of them poorly. But while you were thinking, while you were speaking, I got stuck on another thing regarding the Dillinger Escape Plan here, because you said Greg Puciato is doing his Retrowave project, but he also did recently Killer Be Killed with Max Cavalera and Brent Hines, and I forget the name of the drummer, Troy something. Anyway, the drummer
Sandals?
Zappa's drummer.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's an interesting project, and it's a weird project because it doesn't sound like anything anyone expected from that project. It doesn't sound really like Dillinger, doesn't sound like Mastodon, doesn't sound like Zappa, and doesn't sound like anything Max has ever done. And the main creative direction behind that was actually Max Cavalera, and it's interesting because everybody brings their own imagery from their own bands to that one. Because Greg looks like he looks in Dillinger, Max looks like he always looks, and
Yeah.
But it's a really weird. That album really surprised me because it did have the texture and small elements that everyone brings to the table, but it sounded nothing like any of their bands or anything anyone expected. And some people were disappointed by that, but I was just pleasantly surprised. And it's an interesting example.
Just to put the record straight, it's Greg, Max, Troy Sanders from Mastodon, and Ben Coller from Converge on the drums.
No, Ben Coller is now on drums.
Oh right, he switched with Dave Ellich, who from the Mars Volta.
Okay, yeah, sorry, my bad.
Yeah, it's okay. Just to set the record straight. So I think that Kill or Be Killed. I mean, I like the album, but their image and the album itself sort of sounded to me like what outsiders imagine that metal is like, because it has all the metal influences, the mainstream metal influences on it. It has screamed vocals, it has harsh vocals, it has clean vocals, it has drum fills, it has blast beats, it has all sorts of stuff. It's like a generic metal album. Not a bad one. I liked it, but it's a bit of that, a bit of this, a bit of that. So, and the image is the same. They look like stereotypical metal performers from different eras in the genre.
Different eras, yeah.
so the drummer is like this Mars Volta-ish experimental. He wears these loose clothing and stuff like that. And Troy is like a more hipster influenced, and Max like old school thrash and stuff like that. So it's amusing to me, this conglomerate, this collective of metal images. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, that album really caught me off guard. And in fact, speaking about Max, that guy, his imagery and his sound, it's also has gone through a really interesting progression, because he was originally the guitar vocalist of Sepultura, and they were doing like really heavy thrash death, and they were one of the pioneers of like the thrash death type of sound. And then he left the band because of personal conflicts and did his own Soulfly thing, and that band was originally very, very focused on imagery. They called their fan base the Tribe. They had a lot of tribal imagery, and they sung about being together, one tribe, and it was a very communal experience. And over the years, it kind of became whatever. They still kind of have some themes, but it's not as strong anymore. But then he started making Soulfly heavy again, and he started dressing heavier again, and then he made Cavalera Conspiracy with his brother from Sepultura, and they also kept going heavier and heavier. And Max's progression in general is very interesting to me, because he's done a bunch of different things while doing the same thing all the time. He is a very, very singular person.
I think that the thing that we have to remember about Max and Sepultura in general is that they come from Brazil. And this is one of the less mentioned and yet super influential countries in the metal universe. And no one seems to talk about it. Brazil has been on metal side for years. From Rock in Rio with the famous Iron Maiden show. Back when Iron Maiden was big, but it was like 1 million people there. Literally 1 million people. And Sepultura and Angra, which is a really good progressive power metal band, one of the best. A lot of good stuff comes from there, but I feel like the bands that, especially Sepultura, they kind of set the tone, they sort of struggle with the imagery, because on one hand they want to embrace their culture, and Sepultura is all about that, right? Roots, bloody roots, And
Soulfly even more so, I guess.
Soulfly even more so, tribal iconography and stuff like that. But on the other hand, they want to be their own thing. They don't want to be the band from Brazil. They want to be Sepultura. So Sepultura is a really interesting example, and one which relates to me, because they came to Israel to film a video in the 90s when Israel was nothing. I mean, musically, we had one band that got a bit famous called Salem. They do black metal. You should listen to them, by the way. You might like them. And they came here. Their song Territory is actually about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they flew all the way here, and the imagery there is sort of like their old imagery, because they go to the Dead Sea and they sing in the mud, which is a very Sepultura thing to do, but it's also very not Sepultura, and it's very global, and it's very not Brazilian. So this is another aspect that we need to consider when we talk about imagery, and we can bring other nationalities into it, right? How do Scandinavian metalists
I was
look?
just about to say that. Like
Yeah.
a lot of the folky, blacky bands, and we discussed this last week, have very successfully brought their local image to the global scene, and in fact turned it into not a weakness but a strength.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the thing on the humor side here, I remember all these gifs with the Varg's hair blowing in the wind, and it's like a L'Oreal shampoo commercial. And this is sort of like how people expect Scandinavian bands to look like. Long, smooth hair, very maybe feminine in a way, but very beautiful and powerful. Or, and I can't believe we haven't mentioned this band yet in this discussion, Amon Amarth. Right?
Yes, I was.
You were just going to say that, right?
We're like mind meld right now.
Yes, because the Viking imagery, and they were in a Viking movie this year. It's not a good movie, by the way. It's fine, I guess, but Viking movies are a pet peeve of mine because I study Viking culture and it's nothing like it. But the
imagery is totally the real imagery is totally different.
Yeah, but or maybe we can bring another band here, Sabaton. They go on and they have tanks and Wehrmacht flags and armor and stuff like that. Amon Amarth as well. They go on with bucklers and axes, and they have the wild beards which scream Viking culture. So.
And the tusk, they drink beer out of a tusk.
Yeah, they drink beer out of it. It's not beer, it's mead, right?
Mead, my bad.
So, I think that, and again, I want to go back to the question that you asked about that Finnish band. How much of it is commercial? Because Amon Amarth are a product. They have, I mean, if you told me that Amon Amarth have action figures, I wouldn't be surprised. Another name that pops into mind now, and this is definitely commercial. I hate this band, and that's one of the reasons. Manowar. Manowar have everything. They have, I shit you not, condoms. They have, yeah, they do. My friend bought one as a joke in Hellfest 2009. Manowar were playing, and the merch table had Manowar condoms and ice cream and everything, tents and hats and everything, just everything. So this is maybe an extreme example, but that's not that far from Amon Amarth, right? And the metal, the reverse Thor's hammer medallion, which has become the symbol.
This imagery kind of lets Amon Amarth get away with being simple, and people are like, "Oh yeah, they're simple, sure, but it's like good, heavy Viking metal."
Which
like,
is what we said about punk, right? It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's how the image strengthens and excuses stuff which you wouldn't excuse from other bands. And if we talked about vocalists earlier, Amon Amarth's lyrics, they've released one song, basically, from the start of the band. All their songs are about the same thing. They choose an aspect of Viking mythology, they continue to aggrandize it, make it something which, by the way, it wasn't in the sagas. If you go and read the text, I don't know how many of you, or if you have read original Viking, Icelandic sagas, they're quite drab. A lot of it is boring. A lot of it, I went here and I sued this guy. They had a whole thing about suing and lawyers and stuff like that. So sure, there are parts where people eat each other's hearts and stuff like that, but it's never like in the Amon Amarth songs. And nobody would excuse this lyrical similarity if it wasn't Amon Amarth. And what do you expect? This is the band, this is the image of the band, this is what they do, and people just let them get away with it.
It's interesting that just occurred to me. A lot of black metal bands, maybe you're not aware of this, but they incorporate Tolkien imagery and names and whatnot.
Definitely.
Which is funny because black metal is a genre known for, they want to bring back the pagan, they want to promote the Aryan race, they want to, whatever. And Tolkien, it's just a fantasy world. It's not really pagan. It's based more on Finnish mythology. And Tolkien himself was kind of known for standing up a little bit to the Nazis and not really being racist, which is tying back to the themes earlier.
I think that we're kind of approaching the end, so we won't get into Tolkien because it's a very, very complex subject.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah, it's very complex, but one thing I can say is, again, dissonance between image and work. there's a very famous story about one of the first bands that used Tolkien in their music is Led Zeppelin. And a lot of the runes are elvish runes, and the singer wears a ring on a chain necklace. So one of the most famous stories is that fans of Led Zeppelin made a pilgrimage to Tolkien's house. But Tolkien is this elderly professor of languages in Oxford, and he wants nothing to do with these dirty hippies on his lawn, right? So he drives them away, and the story goes that he did it at shotgun point. Because he's British, right? So he has a rifle. Yeah. He's old school British, and he didn't shoot them, but he went out with his gun and he said, "Get off my property," right? So, and if you go by the books, what would you imagine Tolkien to be? You would imagine him to be Gandalf, right? And to some extent he is. He smokes a pipe and stuff like that, but he's not jovial and this grandfather figure that people expected him. He was a professor in Oxford. Professors in Oxford tend to be very stuck up, very snobbish, very particular. Again, this is super bigoted about, there are all sorts of professors. But
of course, we're making broad generalizations.
Yeah, obviously. But again, just the dissonance between the image of Tolkien and the image of his artwork, just, it came in well into this discussion.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, there's so much to discuss here, and we could go on for hours and hours, but I think we need to end it at some point here. So
yeah.
That was a cool story to close it all off.
I agree.
And I didn't know that Led Zeppelin had any sort of Tolkien imagery.
Sure, maybe I'll find some images and we can put it in the links below the podcast.
Yeah, weirdly, there's a lot of Tolkien imagery in metal, and maybe we'll go deeper on that on some other day. But Thanks for listening to the podcast, everyone. This is Nayan and Eden.
Bye-bye.
Bye.